It's nice that while we're reading the story today to remember that the three main elements of representation here are right here before us. Both the palms that you brought in your procession, like the crowds there, we'll read about that in a minute, garments thrown away, and of course the donkey that the Lord rode on as a king. But the story starts really a little bit before the procession. Perhaps you remember two sisters named Mary and Martha. They were followers of the Lord, and were told in many different places in the Gospels that he would come and visit them in their house. Well, they also had a brother whose name was Lazarus, and he too was someone who loved the Lord and who listened to his teachings and tried to understand and to follow him. We're told in the Word that Lazarus got very sick. And we know that the Lord could heal people who were sick, and he was a friend of the family. And so you'd think, oh, well, what we think would happen would be that the Lord would say, oh no, Lazarus is sick, and he would rush to their house and make him well. But that's not what happened. It's not what happened. He actually delayed. He delayed on purpose. He waited. So there's Lazarus, and he's very sick, and he actually died. And the Lord could have gone and healed him, but he didn't. Now, you might wonder, why do you think the Lord waited? What was the point of that? And you think, well, what would be harder to do? To fix someone who's sick, or to fix someone who's already dead? What would be a kind of miracle that would show people how the Lord's powers had grown? Remember, he very gently, during the whole course of his life, he started off with little miracles so they wouldn't be startling. He turned some water into wine. And then later he would fix people who had sicknesses, and he did other things. That each time he did a miracle, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. But getting ready for Easter, he needed to do a really big miracle, which was to take someone who was actually dead and bring them back to life. And so when he came to Mary and Martha's house, and they were weeping, and they'd already had the funeral, and Lazarus was in a tomb. And the Lord told them to open the tomb and call him out. He said, Lazarus, come out. And to everyone's great surprise, he did. They were quite sure he'd been dead. And so just before Easter, the Lord did this wonderful miracle. He said, I have the power to raise other people. And of course, the miracle of Easter was he had the power to raise himself. But we'll get more into that later. So he's in Bethany. He's just brought Lazarus back to life. And there were a lot of people around. And of course, people talked about this. News traveled quickly. This is what it says in John chapter 12. Now a great many of the Jews knew that he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but they might also see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests plotted to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews went away and believed in Jesus. So the testimony of the Gospels actually says, the Word actually says that yes, this worked. This miracle that the Lord did, many people saw it, and they began to think about this person, whatever he's teaching, we should listen to it. They began to believe that he had the right ideas and he was going to lead them well. So they began to believe in the Lord. And that made the people in the old church, the leaders of the old church, kind of angry. It's very sad that they were angry, that the Lord, and they actually wanted to kill the Lord. And they wanted to kill Lazarus too, because Lazarus was living, breathing evidence of the Lord's power. So they hated him for that. But Lazarus was soon safe again because the Lord did something even bigger, and that drew all the attention away from Lazarus to himself. We read again from John 12. The next day, a great multitude that had come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees. Here are the branches of palm trees. You were the multitude today when you came in with a procession, just like they did. They took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him and cried, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. That's what they thought. They thought he was a king. They put this thing, in modern days, when somebody really important comes, we pick them up maybe they come in a special airplane, and they have a limousine, and when they come, they take out a carpet. They put a red carpet down on the ground. So when the person walks on it, they don't have to walk on the dirty part. So what this is what happened 2,000 years ago. They didn't have red carpets, so they put palms. See how nicely covered it is? If this was mud, I could walk on it, and I wouldn't get my feet dirty. So that was a special thing they did, and to make it even more special, sometimes people even put their clothes down. They wanted to make sure that his feet didn't get dirty. That was very important. So that's one of the reasons they did this. It was a sign of honor. They were thinking, this is a really important person. We don't know how important yet, but he's really important. And it says, and then again, they called him the King of Israel. Then Jesus, when he found a young donkey, here's a young donkey, he sat on it. And as is written, fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. Now, why in the world would he do that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One reason is that their tradition was that, like we put special people in special vehicles, that the tradition was that when a king was being introduced to the people, he would ride on a donkey and come into the gates of the city, and that was how they would welcome him. Because most people walked, to ride on a donkey was special. We also know that he did it because a donkey is like a horse, and it has a representation in the Word. Anywhere we talk about a donkey or a horse in the Word, it means people who love to listen to and understand the Word. So it was a sign that here the Lord was coming in. It was on the palms. The palms represent different kinds of ideas and truths. The garments represent different kinds of truths. The donkey represents people who love the truth. And on top of all that was the Lord. And he was to be our king. To love the Lord as he is in the Word. That's what the message was for us. But they didn't really understand it so much. They thought he was going to be the king of Jerusalem. Many of the people in those days were angry and confused and troubled by the fact that they had this country, this nice little country, but it was ruled by the Romans. Herod, the king, he worked for the Romans. And they collected taxes, and they had all kinds of really hard rules, and they were mean to the people. And so they wanted a different leader. And here came this gentle man who could heal the sick and raise people from the dead, and he taught interesting things. And they said, all the different things we're going to say, he is the king of Israel. Now, the truth of the matter is the disciples and the people didn't really understand what was going on yet. They were thinking he was going to be a real living king who's going to go to the palace. And the story goes on that when he came to the palace, when he came up the path and he came into Jerusalem, and they expected him to turn and go to the palace because that's where the king would go. But what did he do? If we read further, we find out that actually he turned the other way and he went to the temple. A very important thing, that after he came in and was seen as a king, he said, I'm not king of the world. I'm king of heaven. And that's better. That's what we really want to do. Now, even the disciples didn't understand that at first, and so we can forgive people in the crowds for not really understanding it, and sometimes it takes a while for us to understand it. But the whole message, all the things that were going on, was to say that this person was actually the Lord who created us all, and is the King of heaven, and wants to make sure that we have all the things that we need to get into heaven. Reading a little bit further in John. Therefore the people who were with him when he called Lazarus out of his tomb and raised him from the dead bore witness. And that means they went out and told everybody what they saw. They said, I saw with my own eyes what Jesus did. And wow, was I impressed. And he's the king. And he can do things that no one else can do. And got the idea that he's not really a man. He's something else. He's the king of heaven. Well, we have an advantage here because we already know how this is going to end. We've read the story. It's like, if you were getting a mystery novel, if you went to the last chapter first, we have an advantage here because we know how it's going to end. And we can see the clues. We can see the things that were going on that the Lord was doing that were really shouting out to people saying, this is what I really am. And they were so convinced that he was going to be something else, they kept reading it the other way. That he was going to be the wrong kind of Messiah. The kind of Messiah was going to be a political leader. So it's easy to see that they made a mistake there. But what's important for us to remember is if we think about the meaning of what he did, and we look back on it today, knowing what happens on Good Friday, knowing what happens in Easter, knowing what happens when he came back to visit the disciples afterwards, it all comes together for us and shows that he came on earth to be a king, not of the city of Jerusalem or the country of Israel, but of the holy city, New Jerusalem, which is another name for heaven itself. And that's the reason we're celebrating today. That's the reason we're singing these lovely songs that have Hosanna in it and praise to the Lord in it. They're meant to be uplifting because we're thinking about how when we begin to open our eyes and see what he really intended to do, and really even today, it wasn't just a king 2,000 years ago. The Lord is the king of heaven today. He's our king. And he's setting things up to make it possible for all of us to join him there. And that's the reason why we should be remembering and celebrating on this day. Amen.